Even though we've successfully created a list item for this particular book, we still have the Add a List Item button here, and we should actually be showing Mark as Read and Delete List Item instead. So let's update our Submit Buttons component so it will also query the backend for the list items that this user has created. For this, we're going to need useQuery from React Query. So we'll bring in useQuery and come down here, and instead of assigning this list item to null, we're actually going to call useQuery with a configuration object, and we'll specify our query key is list items. And then our query function, so the function that needs to be called to go get these list items, is going to call the client at the list items endpoint. And this is an authenticated request, so we're going to pass the token with the user.token. And this call is going to give us back an object that has a list items property on it, and we just want to get the list items, so we're going to say .then data.list items. And with that, we're going to get a whole bunch of things like loading state and everything else in here. We actually only care about the data that comes back, and we're going to alias that to list items. So this is all of the list items that this user has in their account. Our backend doesn't have an API for requesting a specific list item for a specific book, so we just get all of the list items for the user, and that ends up being okay because when we're all done, we actually are going to cache all of the list items for the user anyway, so we don't actually need to request a single list item for a single book. So with that, once this finishes loading, then we'll have list items. And we're going to take those list items and find the one that is associated to this book. So we'll say list items.find, and we'll take one list item at a time, and we'll check if the list item.book ID is equal to the book ID that we have. Now keep in mind that this is asynchronous, and so list items may actually not be available until that request completes and we get a re-render with the updated list items. So we're going to add the Elvis operator here so that if list items isn't defined, we will not execute this find, and in that case, we'll just default the list item to be null. Great, so let's save this. We'll come over here, and there it is, awesome. So because we've loaded that list item, we're now seeing mark as read and remove from list. Now, one other thing that I want to do here really quick is we're going to grab another book here, and I can just actually hit enter and it will search all of the books. We'll grab this book, and when I click on add to list, you'll notice that it's not updating, and that's because React Query isn't going to re-request these list items for us automatically. We need to tell React Query that, hey, I just did a mutation that's going to modify the backend in a way that affects the query that you are using to populate that list item. So let's invalidate that query. So let's come over here, and as an option to our use mutation call, we're going to add an onSettled. So whether this succeeds or fails, we're going to call this function, which will invalidate the query for list items. To do that, we actually need the query cache from React Query. So we'll come down here with that and say query cache.invalidate queries. And the query that we want to invalidate is based on this query key. So we'll copy this and paste it right there. So this query will be made invalid when this function settles, whether it rejects or resolves. So let's save that. Come back over here. We'll go to another book. We'll add this to our list. And there we go. So in review, to query data from the backend with React Query, you're going to use the useQuery hook, which you can pass a configuration object like this with a query key, so React Query can identify the data that comes back for this particular query, and a query function, which React Query will call when it's time to update the data for this particular query. For us, we're going to call the list items endpoint. We'll pass the user's token along so the backend knows that the user's allowed to make this request, and the backend will know which set of list items to send back. And then we get back data that has a list items property, so we'll just grab that. We'll get back our data here from useQuery. We'll alias that to list items, and then when that query finally resolves and we have list items, then we'll look for the list item that's associated to the book for these status buttons. And then to make sure that this mutation updates this query, we added this configuration option for onSettled, so the query cache will invalidate this query, which will trigger another call to go get that data. and refresh the cache. One potential optimization that we could make here is after this mutation finishes to manually update the query cache with the data we get back from this mutation, because it does in fact have the list item data. And that would work fine, but I think that you'll find in practice, surgically updating a cache is a great way to create a lot of stale data bugs. And not only is this easier, but it also helps you avoid those stale data bugs.